Hi, I'm Andy Ellis. I'm the host of this show and a potential Green Party candidate for governor of Maryland in 2026. I'm using this show to highlight interesting people and ideas that help me and you to understand what is happening and what is possible. You can learn more about the campaign by going to gogreen2026.com. Guests on this show do not necessarily support my campaign or the Green Party. They've agreed to come on to discuss ideas and issues. And of course, click the subscribe button on YouTube so you can keep up to date with this podcast. Hi, and welcome to the show. It's May 2nd, 2024, and let's get to it. Tonight we'll be talking about public banking. In an extractive capitalist economy designed to create economic inequality and political polarization, debt, credit, and capital play a key role in making the system function. Banks are the institutions responsible for regulating that function. Those with power and money have tried and succeeded to convince us to normalize the vision of banks as just private businesses. But there will always be resistance to such efforts, and there's a long history of reform efforts which have sought to make banks serve the public good instead of private profit. Public banks, broadly defined as banks controlled by government and not corporations, have long been an idea advocated by populists, economic justice advocates, and socialist and progressive political parties. Here in Maryland, we've seen legislation introduced to study public banking, and it is part of our campaign's agenda for a solidarity economy. Yet, despite all of the economic justice that the public banking offers, it has been hard for reforms to gain traction, and perhaps even harder for the few examples we do have of actual public banks to deliver on the promise of economic justice. Today's guest is the perfect person to talk about this issue with. Matt Stannard is a longtime organizer, writer, researcher, podcast producer, and advocate for democratic socialist policies and material justice. Matt has been co-chair of Southeast Wyoming Democratic Socialists of America, as well as the policy director of Commonomics USA and the media director of the Public Banking Institute. You can read his writings at Occupy, Truth Out, Common Dreams, Yes Magazine, and other publications, including his blog, Cowboys on the Commons. His podcasts have included Shared Sacrifice and Solidarity House Cooperative. He lives on the coast of Oregon. Welcome, Matt.
With my dog and partner on the coast of Oregon.
Excellent.
Sorry,
Excellent.
I should have dialed in that last minute edit.
Well, there you go. But welcome, Matt, who lives on the coast of Oregon with his partner and his dog.
Yeah, it's great to be here and a little bit familiar territory. It's almost like I've been hanging out in this space intermittently.
Absolutely, and we started the series of podcasts with you and I talking about some things, but I'm really happy to reverse it tonight and get to the conversation of tonight's discussion, which is public banking and the solidarity economy and the hazards of single issue politics. So let's get to it.
Yeah, let's do it. And I want to say, those who are watching this on video will see that I'm affiliated with Democratic Socialists of America. Obviously, anything I'm saying in this space is all me. And although DSA has, I think a good, healthy interest in public banking as a policy, I'm not speaking for DSA and really not speaking for any organization right now. Be talking about is the need to sort of be candid about what organizations can and can't do in order to achieve these goals.
Absolutely. I appreciate that disclaimer. And I also appreciate that you're independent right now and can approach this with that voice, because I think it is important that we have this conversation candidly and we don't do it, in line with any particular organization's interests. Let's get to the conversation and the details about it and not somebody's agenda. So with that, let me start here. Can we start off with what I hope is a kind of easy question? Lots of people talk about why banks are bad, but I think it matters, and you point this out, why we criticize the bankers. Can you talk about the harms you see that come from private banks and why it matters how we frame these harms?
Well, I have a lot to say about both halves of that question. So let's really start with the first one, and then I want to know if there's any kind of follow up on that.
Yep, let's start with the first half.
Yeah, let's start with why do you hate banks, Matt? I guess in some, Private banking is extractive. It allows the extraction of wealth as a benefit of wealth, of having wealth. You get to use your money to extract more money, essentially. And it privatizes a huge social power and incentivizes, in doing so, further extraction and growth at all costs. Because it vests this tremendous power, the power to basically create value through lending and through other manipulation of currency, vests that power in the hands of private ownership, and it allows banks to perform that function while really insidiously creating negative externalities, externalizing the fallout and the costs of that extraction, which inevitably is going to land on the weakest and most vulnerable and most oppressed sectors of society, as well as the most delicate and unprotected of our ecosystems. All of that, this growth imperative that's created by the privatization of lending, interest, the definition of value, and the creation of value that comes particularly through fractional reserve lending, the power to do things like that. Normally, we look at that sort of tremendous power, or, philosophically, we look at that kind of power and we say, where should that power be vested? Should that power be democratized? Should it be owned by the people and kind of governed and robustly regulated by the people? Or should it be, essentially in private hands under, some notion that that's going to generate something that's in everybody's interest? And I think what we've seen historically is that private banks have accompanied some of the worst things that the worst disasters that we've seen in our socioeconomic history. If you're a banker, you get to determine how to use that magical power, and that's more than private actors should be allowed to do. So that's sort of the nutshell.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good nutshell. I imagine that that question alone could be an entire topic, but we don't want to just talk about the harms of it, and so we'll get to some of the other parts of it later. But I do want to pick up on this point that you mentioned in one of your Occupy articles, that it is important to understand why and who is criticizing the bankers. And I think that's a really useful point to make here. And I'd like to hear you talk about that a little bit and expand on it.
Sure. And I hope we can circle back on questions like, kind of some history and stuff like that if we have time. But I appreciate the opportunity to kind of talk about I think that this is something that we talk about as advocates. We talk about as essentially debate coaches, whether literally debate coaches or, using those same kinds of skills of teaching persuasion and teaching ethos. So I think it's a movement question, but it's also a question of like sort of the forces of history that are at work in these questions, and that is that it matters what you're criticizing the banks for. It matters who you're assigning or attributing that power and that corruption to. And I think that, for me, history is full of examples of the ruling class kind of getting away with doing things because they're able to kind of raise up the specter of some sort of conspiracy that doesn't involve them, that doesn't involve, capitalism, that can blame it on one, ethnic group or another nationality or other types of identity questions. And I think that the discourse around banking is no exception. So, I plan hopefully on at some point I wanted to write an article entitled "The Weirdness of the Monetary Reform, MMT, Public Banking, the weirdness around some of the sort of historic thought leaders of these movements, and sort of where a lot of these things, a lot of these ideas tend to land." And so I'll just give an example that I describe in. Well, I'll just go ahead, if I can. I'll just go ahead and read
Sure.
from one of my Occupy articles, which I know you're linking to the show, because in 2018 I wrote, I kind of, having stepped out of the movement, I kind of wrote 10 articles in 6 months about that experience. And one of the things that I wanted to say was that it matters why you criticize the bankers, which is the heading of this particular article that I know that you'll link to on the show. Not everyone who attacks powerful private banks does so from a position of justice or a desire for economic democracy. Nazis, racists, and ethno-nationalists have also scapegoated big banks, and this has caused a lot of confusion, tragedy, and defeat for those interested in real emancipation. Nazis and racist Christians before them constructed their criticisms of banking practices as anti-Semitic attacks on international bankers. Inevitably, some of these people gravitated toward the public banking movement, and the post-Occupy iteration of the movement was not as careful as it should have been in distancing itself from those anti-Semitic and conspiratorial rabbit holes. This opened the door to engaging with fans of G. Edward Griffin, a John Birch Society member and co-facilitator of a notorious 2009 conference on Jekyll Island off the coast of Georgia that the Southern Poverty Law Center said helped reignite the patriot and militia movement. I've personally had to deal with these people when offering media support to the public banking movement. At the 2013 Public Banking Institute conference, amidst throngs of progressive, centrist, and thoughtful conservative attendees, there was a small handful of wide-eyed, white, 60-something men, a couple of whom asked me whether I'd read Griffin's work in the same way Jon Stewart asked Guillermo Diaz in Half-Baked whether he'd ever seen the back of a $20 bill on weed. While managing PBI's media operations, I periodically had to flick off and disclaim the anti-Semitic or white supremacist messages of one or two social media followers. While I was happy to do it, I often wished some of the most prominent standard bearers of the movement would have taken more proactive anti-racist positions. It's not just the violence and genocidal thinking of Nazism that makes me concerned, although that's a key part of it. Such rhetoric also jeopardizes our politics, turning systemic critique of political economy into conspiratorial mumbo-jumbo where democratic deliberation is needed. You can't liberate one group from oppression by scapegoating another group. Systems based on hatred and hierarchy thrive only through excess and extraction. They last only so long as they can buy people off. Once the resources run out, individual acts of violence maintained, those systems give way to genocide. The Trump campaign's constant rhetoric of interpersonal violence illustrates this. Public banking is cooperative and so requires denouncing violent nationalism and racism rather than quietly accepting it. And then I go on to say that fortunately, in the one space where I think that most headway has been made in the public banking movement, and that is the California public banking movement, that a lot of those influencers and a lot of that kind of dead weight was brushed aside in 2016, 2017, 2018, when a very, very powerful and diverse coalition of left progressives, kind of created a new public banking movement there. And although they have not been ultimately successful for reasons that I also get into in some of my essays, it's good to see that that they are the ones who kind of made the most headway. But this is also something, I think, to be fair, that the left and progressive advocates often encounter. It's a problem in Green Party spaces. It's a problem in socialist spaces. And it's certainly a problem, a huge problem in BDS and, in trying to find, progressive solutions to the conflict in the Middle East. And so it's not really anything special, except that there's something about the rhetoric of banks. There's something about the rhetoric of money. And I think it's tied to this idea of banking as a sort of sovereign power. It is it really is a power to sort of control the economy if you have a monetary economy. And so I think that attracts a particular type of ideological crusader on the right as well. And so that's something that the movement has sort of had to deal with. And in fact, several members, a few members of the public banking board of directors, including founding members of the board, were Trump supporters and believed that Trump would herald a kind of anti-banking revolution, and even would be open to things like MMT, modern monetary theory, and sort of the, just let's fund anything as long as it's, sort of the central state that's doing it, guided, I suppose, by Bannon, right? Going here, let's fund everything. Let's, eliminate poverty. There were, that's what they believed about Trump. And those types of fantasies come from are offshoots of these Bircher far right kind of conspiratorial fantasies that are also anti-Semitic.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I want to get to the history of public banking in a second, but I want to ask a question here. You sort of you make the argument in the passage that you were reading there that this work has to be approached with an ideology of some sort and rooted in a sense of justice. And so you also make an argument in other places that the movement has often focused on reform for reform's sake, an almost explicitly non-ideological approach in order to be able to include Birchers and democratic socialists.
Yeah, get everybody. Yeah, Big Ten approach.
And can you talk about how that emerged within the movement over time, or in the recent version of the movement, and what consequences it has had for the success of the movement?
A huge part of it was that in adopting and I one thing I didn't I kind of alluded to but didn't really talk about much is, a lot of this sort of kind of chaotic ideological chaos and pluralism happened around Occupy. And those of us, including yourself, who, can remember a little bit about that time, it was like sort of, well, what are they saying? What's the message? What's the program? And there was a vacuum, and that vacuum quickly became filled by, all kinds of different voices, some good and some, and some not good. And so remind me what was your question, kind of coming into
yeah. Can you so like in some of your writing you criticize this non-ideological approach?
Sure.
Reform for reform's sake.
Yeah, or pragmatic sort of pluralism, or pragmatic reform, like innocuity.
Not based on an ideological commitment to justice and equality.
We don't want to alienate anybody, and I think that so coming out of Occupy, there was some desire by some folks to create entities, and those took the form of nonprofit entities, including both of the organizations that I worked for. One a 501c3, the other a 501c4. And I think that in some ways in that process, you then become, kind of a donor-funded organization on the one hand. And so there is a desire to, stick to universal messages and messaging. And that desire is not necessarily bad in and of itself, nor is the desire to get into as many meetings with city council folks and municipalities and community, different community members and different leaders and stakeholders, and to do all of those things. We want to materialize these goals. We need money to do it. We need, to be, to have the ear of policymakers to do it. I think that for me, the root of the problem in that approach, which is an inevitable approach, is that if it's not informed by a larger commitment to structural justice, to ending structural violence, to having an intersectional and truly solidarity-based approach to economic liberation, then it's easy to fall into the habit of thinking of both nonprofits and electoral reformists that good ideas are enough, that it is enough to have a good idea, and it is enough to approach people influentially, approach influential people in good faith, as well as just to get kind of public support and to do that kind of lobbying work, soft lobbying, hard lobbying. Good ideas are not enough. And the big bridge and the big divide in the public banking movement was, on the one side, or on the one hand, folks who saw it as a manifestation of a post-capitalist and emancipated economy. And on the other side, folks who literally saw it as a way to save capitalism. And so our co-founder and thought leader and leading author, Ellen Brown, got an op-ed published in the New York Times, the title of which and the entire thesis of which was, that public banks could save capitalism, that they're essential to saving capitalism. And so I think that by not being part of a larger movement, and by and see, even this all exists in tension, because on the one hand, we are out there with that message, and then we're also like trying to hook up with solidarity economy folks and new economy coalition folks and Greens, and Ellen herself ran as a Green in the 2014 election in California. And so in one of my blog posts, I talk about it as a bridge, a collapsing bridge. And it's that contradiction and that tension that was the source of, I think, for me, a lot of cognitive dissonance and feeling of frustration. And I also think is sort of the ultimate reason why most proponents of public banking haven't necessarily seen the massive need for movement building that would underlie such an effort. And that is why we've had dozens upon dozens, probably hundreds of initiatives around the country in the last, couple of decades trying to create public banks, and they have all failed. They've all failed. They have failed because of death by 1,000 cuts of the feasibility industrial complex and the task force death squads, which are all populated by folks in the industry, in the financial industry. And so you start to see that, you start to see those patterns. And at least for some of us, you started to see how, there are certainly causes and there are certainly policies that you can work with a variety of folks on. But ultimately, big capital and big banks and countless intermediaries will do anything to gum up and stop and interfere with any kind of municipal efforts or state efforts to democratize the economy.
Yeah, I think
there's too much at stake, too much easy profit actually at stake. That's the thing about finance capital and the profit margins of the finance industry, is that it's easy money. It doesn't require, the upfront exploitation of massive resources and labor. Anyway,
I think that's an interesting point and an interesting parallel. Like the nonprofit advocacy sector uses access and ideas as its sort of currency and its leverage. So it is like, we are able to get, hey, great news, the two of us have a meeting with such and such legislator or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. Always just a really exciting thing. We get to sit down. Yeah.
And it's not based on power. It's not based on people who, it's based on ideas that should be good enough to convince this person to implement them. It's not based on an upswell or not always based, at least, on an upswell of public support. And even if it is based on an upswell of public support, the nonprofit advocacy sector is often not actually representing that public. They're actually often, I think, sort of channeling what is good for them, which is,
and often downplaying the any kind of mass movements. Because they, there is an assumption that that's going to make the power brokers nervous.
Right.
And so that's part of it. And I mean, I think a meeting would be great if I could begin that meeting with, hey, I've got 50,000 people outside this building.
Right.
And they would love to know how you feel about banks.
Have a meeting because people are putting enough pressure on the legislator to have a meeting, not because you knew somebody who went to grad school with the legislator or something like that, and they can get you.
And that's precisely. Yeah. And I get fight the war on all fronts and that kind of thing, but I think that I have in studying movements both outside as a scholar and inside as an organizer, the story that the narrative that rings truest with me is the finite resources of movements, the finite energy of movement activists, and the focus trade-offs that occur. And if you are not trying to build a mass movement, and at one point in the articles I say, LA, LA had, Los Angeles a few years ago had a referendum that they have unfortunately lost, where public banking unfortunately lost because opponents were able to, really, really confuse people, and proponents were making good arguments, but good arguments are not enough. And, and at that time I said, you need tens of thousands of people in LA in the streets demanding this. And I don't know if there are 10,000 people in America
who will demand
demanding public banking.
Yeah, or at least willing to get in the streets for it.
that, and that was a little bit, I might have been exaggerating, because honestly, the the numbers in terms of people reached by organizations like PBI and Commonomics USA and others were quite impressive numbers. But the question is, what does it take to get people out? And I think what it takes is an understanding and a theory that building a mass movement is prerequisite
Yeah.
to
And
being
it,
able to go to the bargaining table with any sort of legitimacy or power.
yeah, I think this is an interesting tie to the conversation we had a couple of weeks ago with Jack Santucci about electoral reforms, and the ability that he raised that I thought was really interesting was that, like, sometimes we might be able to win some of these things. We might get an initiative passed somewhere to allow public banking, right? But then the fight begins, and the fight begins in order to be able to direct it and steer it in the right direction and make sure that it's
Sure.
oriented toward justice, and to make sure that if it is oriented toward justice, we keep it, right? Like, and it doesn't get repealed.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
I think that segue about this banking reform and that electoral reform is really interesting, because Jack's argument is that electoral reformers often go for this non-party approach to electoral reform because it's easier, it makes business happier, it's easier to sell to people. It doesn't have the same kind of polarization that might come if you say we need to have a socialist party, for example. And he says that those reforms are easy to pass and that they're ultimately bad for the function of democracy. And I think there's a similar thing that is happening here, which is when you strip the ideological out of it, or you strip the partisan out of it in the electoral case, it becomes easy to sell, but kind of worthless in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I think that it is, when you were talking about the necessity to have the reform rooted in a movement that has people and power that can put pressure, it felt like that connection became really clear. Let me ask a question. So we kind of skipped over some of the history stuff. I want to
Mm-hmm.
get to the movement stuff. Do you want to do a brief sort of the quickest, well, you don't have to do it super quick, but
Sure. Sure.
do you want to do the history of public banking in America?
I can give a very quick history that emphasizes what I think are the most important things. There's plenty of places people can read about it. I know that you also have a blurb on the episode description about what public banking is, and I noticed that we didn't really spend any time defining it in this conversation. But and
Yeah.
so I'm assuming that there's going to be some front ending in terms of that, so that we're not just completely sailing without a flag or
Well,
something.
we
But
may be a little bit out of port without that flag, but why don't you give us that? Why don't you give us your definition and then your
sure.
overview of the history?
Sure. So a public bank is a publicly owned entity, like a public utility or a government owned business. And it functions as a bank, but because it is not governed by the profit motive, and because it is run in the public interest, it can leverage financing, loans, emergency loans, traditional loans. It can do retail or non-retail banking, business banking. It can do emergency funding of all kinds of public services, just as a normal bank would, but at low or no interest. Any interest that is collected is returned back into the bank and then out to the public in the form of some kind of dividend or other kind of public savings. And so essentially it is, the people are lending money to themselves, and using the power of fractional reserve banking and kind of fiat currency in order to do that. And as I said, the great evil of banking is that it's this tremendous magic power to create value and to leverage and liquidate, finance. And it, when kept in private hands, becomes prohibitively expensive and controlling in undesirable ways. Having a government, if it's a good government, control those things means that banking will be done in the public interest and with a lot less extraction and a lot more consciousness, political consciousness. This is an old idea. This is a very, very old idea, hundreds, if not thousands of years old. And so there's a global history. The only thing outside of the US that I'll mention is that it was one of the possible demands and one of the possible strategies considered by the Paris Commune. And they wanted to have a people's bank, basically, that was, very much like a public bank. And had they had one and gotten one, it might have changed a lot. It might have, really altered the course of that particular rebellion. But in 1915, there were some public bank experiments earlier. But in 1915, in North Dakota, a political party called the Nonpartisan League, which was an agrarian, populist, socialist party, took over all of the branches of the North Dakota government, and in the process created a public bank, the Bank of North Dakota. That movement died, that party died, which is an interesting twist on this, if you can keep it sort of question, right? Because the Nonpartisan League died, but North Dakota has been a pretty conservative state ever since. But it survived. It was useful during the Depression. It was useful, after. And then, it has been a stabilizing force in a lot of different ways in North Dakota ever since. It's also been used for some really shitty things. And that is part of sort of this, this is tremendous power. This is the power of the state to leverage finance the same way that the private sector can. And that means that if the wrong people are doing it, it sucks.
Right. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think that the win is not simply getting the bank to be controlled by the state. The win has to be getting the state to be controlled by people who are oriented toward economic justice.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Since that time, since the Bank of North Dakota, and especially in the 2000s, but certainly earlier than that, because I've talked to people that have campaigned for public banks for decades and decades, but especially the recession of 2008, the crash of 2008, and then the Occupy movement, and kind of a lot of the politics that came out of Occupy and into Bernie Sanders' campaign, as well as the rise of DSA and other left groups. Public banking there have been many, many, many efforts at public banking, and not all of them have been really hard left efforts. Again, there have often been, efforts that are, I don't want to minimize the fact that there are sometimes just people that don't consider themselves overtly political that come together on these things in municipal contexts or even state contexts and say, this is a good idea. So Phil Murphy campaigned on creating a public bank in New Jersey, but I predicted that he would fold. And I don't want to take some kind of special credit for that. I could have predicted, that a number of teams that didn't make the playoffs wouldn't make the playoffs, right? But he folded, and there've just been a few articles, I just think in the last few months, where writers are starting to, New Jersey, media is starting to ask, what happened to this proposal? What happened to this promise? And what happened was, the private finance industry came in, and the feasibility industrial complex and task force death squads did their work.
I think there's this interesting part there, which is even when people who are not particularly leftist consider these things, there's no sneaking something like this in if the goal is to redistribute economic power to people and to democratize it, right? And I think a lot of time there's this sort of idea of those of us who like to dwell in policy that is haha, we're going to get this reform passed and nobody's going to know how actually revolutionary it is. And it is look, the industries who you would be targeting and trying to take their power and their money away, they know exactly what you're doing, right?
Yeah,
and
yeah.
there's no sneaking it by them. You
Yeah.
know, like that's
Yeah.
not the way government works. That's not the way the policy works. If it has the ability to redistribute power and wealth and the way that it does, and that it works best only if it does that, right? Like maybe it's marginally better that North Dakota has a bank that is publicly run as opposed to private banks. It at the very least gives opportunity that if people take control of the government who are more justice oriented, they can steer the bank in that direction.
Even absent that, even with, the Bank of North Dakota doing things like, funding, emergency policing in Standing Rock, which was the basis of my article in Yes Magazine. Even with that, they'll still turn around and give really, really good rates on student loans, and will still turn around and give emergency loans to farmers who are victims of floods, or to fix schools if there's something, if there are other infrastructure problems in North Dakota. And that's the sort of double-edged sword, because in order for North Dakota to become a peak oil producing state, they needed an infrastructure. And the Bank of North Dakota helped them get that infrastructure. Now, the Bank of North Dakota could just as easily turn around and say, let's fund a wholesale conversion to post-carbon energy in the state of North Dakota. And that would happen. But in order for that to happen, and it would happen, better and more efficiently than it would with private banks. But for that to happen, you would have to have different people running the government. The bankers themselves might be kind of ideologically neutral, but ultimately those goals are part of a state's portfolio that that is more of a political question ultimately.
Exactly. And if we're democratizing the distribution of power and wealth that the bank has, then we need movements that are influencing the way that democracy functions, and are able to put pressure, right? Like it's one of the themes that I think has run through a lot of the conversations that I've had with folks this year is it's never just about the best idea. It's about the pressure that you can build behind that idea to make it so that the government either implements it or loses, right? Like at the end of the day, if we're talking about electoral politics and we're talking about governmental politics, it's not about the best idea or the sort of idea that like, oh, well, once we have it, though, they won't fight to use it for their own means. And I think that gets us back to this point about movement building. And I want to return to something you talked about in one of these Occupy articles. So in that Occupy series, you argue, therefore, in order to not fail, the movement must gather critical mass. Cities and states with public banking supporters numbering in the hundreds need to gather enough people together to number in the thousands, and ultimately the tens of thousands. That can only happen if the public banking movement establishes itself as an integral part of a larger movement for economic, social, racial, gender, and ecological justice. A transition from Wall Street banking to public banking is a paradigm shift, not merely a policy shift. Only mass movements can shift paradigms. I love the way that you put it here. And instead of, we've been talking about the history and the hurdles, and I want to start talking about the possibility a little bit. So what would it look like if it were different, if the movement for public banking was rooted in a movement for peace, democracy, and justice?
I think that in many ways, this is something that started to really, really take hold in California in 2016, 2017, into 2018. There were very specific reasons for that. Organizations, including organizations I was working with, reached out to the widest possible spectrum of economic progressive groups, anti-racist groups, community empowerment groups. There were meetings held and coalitions formed, and folks who had been actually, working in the field long before I was, who were instrumental in building the foundations of many of those groups and many of those movements. And they were doing them in urban spaces like Oakland and San Francisco and Los Angeles. They were doing them in places like Santa Rosa, and well, there were a number of large to medium large municipalities involved, and that also converged with another kind of exigency, which was there was a large movement of folks who were interested in the legalization of cannabis as an instrument of reparations and an instrument of community empowerment as well. And it happened that one of the impediments to state by state legalization, or at least a difficulty, which ended up not being much of a difficulty, but initially was a difficulty, was how that cannabis money would be banked. And so there was a convergence of kind of the left side of the cannabis legalization movement, a network of economic justice groups and holistic intersectional justice and anti-racist groups, and immigrant rights, and homeless empowerment and awareness, and just a number of different things like that. And so there were a number of meetings that took place, kind of building meetings, coalition building meetings, meetings that were facilitated with an aim of coming up with an agenda for economic justice and making sure that that agenda was created first and was inclusive and comprehensive, and had integrity, where kind of everyone was included. And then, having created that economic agenda, that socioeconomic agenda, those who were in the public banking movement then came forward and said, this is how this happens if we charter a bank. This is how this happens if we can create lending opportunities in certain communities, and also create banking opportunities in unbanked communities where people needed retail banking. And there were folks who were involved in the postal banking movement, which was also a movement to protect the public commons and not merely to extend the right to, the ability to bank and the ability to have financial access, but also to do so in a way that would save the postal commons as well. And so there was a huge, what felt to me like a commons-based movement. And because of that, it was naturally disinclined to capitalism. It was not looking for trying to win over the folks that were, for whom any kind of reform had to be accompanied by some sort of change in market strategies and profit, some sort of dynamic of profit. And I can contrast that to a lot of places, a lot of other states where the movement did not gather that kind of momentum and was quickly, these sort of risk analysts and these kind of skeptics would quickly say things like, well, we don't need this. Banks could if banks can just make themselves a little bit more accessible, then we can, are you just saying, you're just saying banks need to lend more, right? So we can do that. And as far as these banking services, well, let's put banks in Walmart. Let's have Walmart operate a bank, or let's have any one of a number of retail centers. We'll just add banking. Open up Wells Fargo in those banks or whatever. And so there's always going to be some kind of private sector reformist answer in those spaces, like, and so, I mean, there's a bunch of states like Colorado. In one of the articles, I talk about the Colorado Banking Board that would have to approve the application for a charter for a public bank in Colorado, and who serves on that board are people who would never approve a public bank charter in the state of Colorado. They just wouldn't do it. And so as it turns out, the initiatives that came out in various California communities, even though the state sort of balked and pushed back on it, counties and cities, started into the process by assuming that this was something that would be controlled by the executives of these cities and counties. And that this was not, we weren't going to ask permission. We were going to establish, public banks that were controlled by the organs of government. And that still wasn't enough to stop the consultation feasibility industrial complex. But it got further along and got a larger critical mass behind it. And it's still an open question in California. We could still see a city finally going, okay, we're going to make this happen. And there is still, almost as many examples of cities painfully slowly moving forward on these proposals as there are of ones that have been pushed back. And we can't really say that about almost any other state or local entity in the lower 48 or Alaska or Hawaii, for that matter, both of which whom also had public banking movements.
And I think that localization of the effort speaks to the grassroots nature of the coalition to some degree, and that because there was a coalition that emerged from people who were doing justice work already for a statewide effort, they were able to go back to their community and use the knowledge of the statewide effort and some of the leverage of the statewide effort to make a compelling case at the local level. And I think that speaks to the value of trying to have. To me, it does. I'm not sure what your opinion on it is, but that speaks to the value of having a big focus, having a big goal, focusing on getting the state to do it, but also developing the organizing and the organizational capacity to push if that isn't where the success comes in. And to me, that's what movement politics start to look like, as opposed to access politics, is that.
Yeah. And the, as the title of the show, like single issue versus, versus something broad. To me, it is the best application that I can think of in our, somewhat politically pluralistic and chaotic society that I can think of the notion of a vanguard. The reason that California has gone further in this struggle for public banking is that there was a diverse but harmonious progressive coalition as the vanguard of the public banking movement. That the vanguard of the public banking movement was not a small group of people who have this really, this weird secret idea about public banking, that there is a larger force, and that larger force is the one that's setting the political tone, because you can't really count on the single issue advocate to set a political tone that's going to achieve that kind of momentum.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as I'm no Leninist, but I think that the importance of organizing, joining, coalescing, building, being communal in one's political organizing efforts. Don't just write a book. Show up, and show up for all of it. Not having to do all of it, but I'm not just going to show up when public banking's on the agenda.
Right.
I'm going to show up, and even if I'm just helping put away the chairs, I am going to show up every time there is something that advances that larger agenda. It's not just my pet, not just my hobby.
Right. Not just the single issue that is ideologically disconnected from the rest of the issues, but as part of a movement for people who all need a set of different configurations and a reallocation of power and wealth.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
I think so. And I would say that there were folks, as there are in every issue movement and every advocacy movement, there's folks that get that, and folks that, again, are really like, no, on the force of this idea alone, we will be heard. And that's where we need to be, because we don't want to push back, in some way that would alienate, the powerful or whatever. And look, I don't think that you should ever walk away from those spaces. You should not cede the political, and you should not walk away from any office. If there's an office, man, run for it.
Yeah.
But I do think that it is important to see what you're doing as part of something larger, and even to see you as part of something larger. And I think that ideas like public banking, ideas like MMT, to some degree, a lot of these sort of finance-based and monetary-based policies lend themselves to the sort of person that's like, well, I haven't been to any meetings, but I'm writing this book. I've been working on this book for 6 months, and once everyone reads it, it's really going to answer a lot of these important questions about the movement.
Yeah.
And it's like, fine, write the book, but show up at the meetings. And even if you're not the center of the meeting, show up and support, and be counted, and be an asset.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think that's actually, for me, a good segue to talking about the campaign's agenda for a solidarity economy. So we published earlier this year, and you were the primary author on it, an agenda for a solidarity economy. And for me, this came from going and showing up at different people's meetings, going to different events that they're having conversations with folks that are doing the work in these spaces, in order to bring a group of sort of solutions together that I think are practical in Maryland, but are going to take a set of power in order to reorient how the power and wealth is used. And so you wrote this. You were the primary author on this agenda for a solidarity economy, and so I wanted to get some of your thoughts on like what it looks like to have a broader movement, and specifically here in Maryland, to the degree that you want to talk about that and the stuff that is in that document, what it looks like to have not just a single issue focus, like we're going to get public banking, but instead to advocate for a solidarity economy. What does a solidarity economy look like, and what are the pieces of it? I guess I would say.
Well, since we laid out that agenda, and that those policy pieces, of course, you had this terrible disaster with the collapse of the bridge, and you can speak probably to more of the day-to-day conversation around this, but what I'm seeing a lot of is a lot of posturing and finger pointing and argument about who's going to pay for it. And if we assume that there is somewhat of an essential and kind of urgent need to make those repairs to prevent future disasters, that is something that is going to serve the public good as well as wide swaths of the private good. It seems ludicrous that any kind of society would lead by very publicly disagreeing and arguing about which entity is supposed to pay for that. Because I think that, and again, I think that it's one of those things where after you've kind of studied the way that money works and the way that governing works, you kind of realize that that's a choice. That's a choice that these entities make about an imposition of scarcity. And I say that because looking at it from, kind of this idea of, well, if we had a governor with that platform in the governor's mansion, and I don't know if they'd stay in the mansion, they might refunction the mansion and just stay in a modest apartment. But if we had someone with that kind of agenda, then that's not the way the conversation would go. That if that's the way we were governing, that's not the way the conversation would go. It would go, what's the best way, the least harmful way, the most efficient way, the most just way to do every bit of this? And let's do it yesterday. And to me, that's the essence of all of those policies. That's the essence of everything from public banks to UBI, to the idea of creating meaningful transportation infrastructure, to even public ownership of entities which under private ownership create huge inefficiencies and huge negative externalities. And all of them are feasible. All of these things are feasible because feasibility in politics is kind of a construct. And no idea is perfect. And everything, there's always mistakes and there's always errors and there's always going to be controversies and arguments and things like that. But in constructing that agenda, it felt to me like this is an agenda that would be implemented by a government that genuinely took a side of human needs over profits, of environmental needs over profits. And that's the bottom line. And the bottom line is not, will this work or will that work? It is, what are we willing to do and what are we willing to do to work through things? And so to me, the policies in that agenda are examples of the kind of things that a government would do that was committed to work through toward a common goal rather than being fragmented and divided by all of these kind of competing private interests. Yeah, so that's a little abstract, but it's another way of saying, Friedrich Engels once said that essentially that what is true economically is kind of what history and the masses kind of demand be true economically. Like these types of realities are willed into reality. And so the question is, who is doing the willing and who is it for? And this is an agenda that is an agenda for the people and reflects the will of these communities. Reparations and basic income support and public finance, the use of bank lending for the public good, all of those things. So a very ultimate kind of populist, but also kind of careful agenda.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's a great point, because I think if at a sort of reductive level, the political ethos of the Republicans is they only care about profit. The political ethos of the Democrats is they pretend they don't have an ideology. And then we need a force that's political ethos is caring about people and caring about justice. And I think that the agenda that you put together foregrounds that stuff. And I think it's really useful to say this piece of the Ingalls piece about building the power in order to be able to enact the agenda, right? Like we can make a public banking system work if there's enough people who want to make a public banking system work. We can make funding co-ops as the new business formation that helps people in communities if there's enough people who want it. And we can make reparations work if there's enough people who are willing to do it. If we try to do any of these things and go around people without building the power, without building the movement and the power, then we're not going to be able to keep them at the degree at which they actually start to change the distribution of power. Because power is not going to just say, oh, well, look, you got elected and you got some good ideas. Like it's going to use its power in order to marshal people in order to get what it wants done. And I think this emphasis here that is, it's not just the best policy idea. Good policy ideas matter. Bad policy has bad consequences. So good policy that is well thought out and makes economic and political sense matters. And so does the political power and the movements willing to support it, so that we can actually have realigning reform. So in a political context, Jack Santucci, who I said was on last week, identifies three types of reforms, and he says in a political, in an electoral reform concept, there are insulating reforms, realigning reforms, and polarizing reforms. And I think we can, he may not like that I'm doing this, but I think we can apply that model more broadly to other things as well, and say like, look, if we want realigning reforms, we're going to have to fight for them, and we're going to have to fight to keep them. And we're going to have people who support them, not just economists, not just legislators. We're going to need to convince people that a new way to look at the economy is good for them, makes a world where we can all thrive, and is possible. I think the part about a lot of this that is hardest for people is believing that it is possible. And believing that it is possible is not the same thing as believing that it is easy. But like, if it's possible, I think people will fight for it. I think people will build for it if they know that it is about them, that it includes them, and that it is with us for us. And it is not. And so I love that sort of idea that like, look, these are not actually terribly difficult or even innovative policy solutions. They're things that make sense. They're things that cultures around the world have used in order to allow for communal living and for justice. And we can do them. They're possible. We just need to build the power and the people in order to do so.
Absolutely. I think that I think those on the left have somewhat justifiably, kind of said about Bernie Sanders that he often tells maybe 75% of the truth particularly about things like taking power and about enacting economic justice. And that, obviously what's sort of missing is a deeply radical theory of how to take that power and how a political revolution would actually work. And I think that that's fair. And I also think that more than any presidential candidate in the last two election cycles, or more than any major party presidential candidate, and I think almost any presidential candidate, I heard more from Bernie about how this is our job, how we have to make this happen. What I heard, although I felt like, was not articulated the way that I would have maybe articulated it, was that we need numbers. We need people to show up. And I think that in some ways that might have been too difficult an ask, given the way that mainstream politics, the sort of neoliberal image of mainstream politics as being about individual preference and individual choice and individual votes,
Right.
as opposed to movement politics.
Yep.
And so I think that might have been something that caused cognitive dissonance in a lot of folks who were kind of caught in that question. If you look over at Britain and at Labour's, particularly Labour under Jeremy Corbyn, around the same time as the 2020 election and just after. One thing that Corbyn's party was doing was making a lot of promises about a lot of really cool policies. They were going to do something with banking reform and possibly public banks. They were going to create all kinds of income programs. They were going to save the public rail, all of these different things. And I remember somebody in Britain, a progressive in Britain, saying, neoliberal politics and neoliberal culture has taught us to be skeptical of the possibility of collective action and the possibility of doing big, cool FDR kind of New Deal sort of things.
Yep.
Let alone, like reorganizing the means of production and things like that. And so I think that what we see is, people kind of sort of getting it right, but unable, because of the political culture and the corporatized political culture, to translate that into, that means that I need 10,000 people marching here at this point in time. Or as I always say, Obama back in 2009, 2010, could have gotten single payer,
right,
by saying, if he'd wanted it, obviously.
Or he could have gotten court reform, or he could have gotten...
We need 1 million people.
Right.
We need 1 million people on the mall holding up signs that say single payer now. Yeah. You give me 1 million people on the mall holding up signs that say that, I will give you something really, really friggin' close to single payer. There's a reason that didn't happen, even though it was possible, historically possible to happen. Right. And I think that is where seeing that or not seeing that, to me, is kind of coming full circle back to what the public banking movement, or what a lot of people in the public banking movement didn't see, which is, we have to have that first. You have to have, you've got to have those 1 million people at your, alongside you.
Yeah, and I think if we think about the spectrum between insulating reforms and realigning reforms, the less people, if the only people who agree with your reform are the lawmakers who passed it, then it's probably an insulating reform. If you are able to bring people to bear and force the governing coalitions to do things they don't want to do, left to their own devices, then you start to get to realigning reforms. So, like, if the group of people who you're talking to are all the people who get to vote on the thing, it's probably not likely that you're going to convince them to magically disappear their own power, right? In the interest that elected them. If the group of people you're talking to are those 10,000 people, and they are the ones who are motivating the meeting with the elected, then you start to get to reforms that can really realign the way that power and wealth work. And mm-hmm. I think that point is super useful, because I think we are taught in political training and in all of these places that we're supposed to do the simplest version of the thing so that it is as easy as possible for somebody to engage. And I still agree with that a lot of times. I think there are a lot of times when the imposition for everybody to show up is very hard, and it sets up barriers. Mm-hmm. And I think that good political movements have to figure out the line between everybody needs to be in the streets if we want anything to happen and just vote for me in November. It can't be, it's a balance. It's hard, right?
Well, we've talked about this before.
Yeah.
Another thing that it takes is the creation of a political culture where people feel like
Right.
at home in the political culture. And so, some of our earliest discussions about the way that you create a political party that is, part of a political culture rather than just a sort of functionary party,
Right.
probably has a lot to do with that. And in addition to the insular versus, genuine kind of reforms, I would add also a distinction between, I think that a lot of people believe that economic justice is always redistributive. And I think the difference between redistributive and sort of regenerative politics is also an important distinction. Most elected officials feel like what they're being pressed to do is redistributive politics, but many of these things, like public banks, like UBI, like community investment and reparations and co-ops and cooperatives, are actually remaking things, not necessarily redistributing things.
Yeah, and they may redistribute things, right? Like there's probably some in a world in which there is inequitable distribution of power and wealth, and that is both political and economic. Like we do need to redistribute things, but we can't just limit ourselves to sort of redistribution. There has to be regeneration, there has to be redistribution, and there has to be the growing and the creation of new institutions that don't exist right now. I think one of the things that was most interesting, one of the shows that I would reflect on and thinking about this was the show what I did with Dave on, where we were talking about about like using progressive taxation in order to fund the reparation commissions, in order to put more economic power into the communities most affected by the war on drugs. Not just like, not just a reparations that says if you were arrested for cannabis, you get an expungement and you get some money, but instead the jurisdictions that were most hurt by the war on drugs are the ones that most benefit from any progressive redistributive taxation. And then within those jurisdictions, creating economic and democratic containers in order to allow public input and deliberation to shape where those resources go. And I think what you're saying and what Davon's saying are both really interconnected into this. It's not just take it from this group and give it to this group. It's not just we're going to tax the wealthy and give bigger tax breaks. It's also we're going to invest in new institutions that the state may fund, but that the people are using in order to change the way that they relate to politics, to power, to money, and all of those things. And so I think I love that point that it is, you almost can't have redistribution without regeneration.
Well, it's always like very iffy. It's an always very iffy proposition and tentative proposition to continue redistributive politics. And I think one of the things the public banking movement got right was, why are we not funding public services anymore? It's because taxes have become so, such a, so much in the crosshairs of, all these different, types of opposing political forces. And so the other part of, what I've often heard Davon say is, just as Davon says that that dismantling white supremacy is also a matter of building communities where the feelings of white supremacists don't matter, where no one has to rely on the good graces of white people to exist, right? And I think that there is an analog to that in the economic justice movement, and particularly in socialism, where once you have created those regenerative communities, those regenerative policies and apparati, that you are also in some ways liberating yourself from depending on the good graces or depending on the thresholds of the folks that that you are going to initially have to take from.
Yep.
And yes, you're going to have to take it. Yes, there needs to be redistribution, but ultimately the purpose of that is to create a place where the elites don't matter.
Right.
And the more spaces that people create that sort of make the elites defunct and irrelevant, then the fewer threats to the integrity of those changes. Although capitalism is such that it will continue to try to find ways to to kind of plunder and pirate off of that, as it always does with the commons. But it helps if you're no longer dependent on the powerful. And I think that's to me, that's always been sort of the dividing line for me, why I will spend more time, talking about alternative financial systems than I would necessarily just, talking about needing to increase taxes or something.
Yep. And it's like one of the things I like about the Agenda for a Solidarity Economy work that we did, the reparations bill that the LBS introduced this year, is because they're not simply raising taxes in order to be able to pay for more government services that we're dependent on in this debt. It's not like, hey, we just need more revenue to pay for all the stuff that the Democratic governor wants to do. Instead, it is like, we need more revenue so that we can invest in these community-based institutions that are going to work outside of the nonprofit industrial complex, that are going to work outside of begging the government for grants, and instead are going to regenerate community power that can be used in order to change outcomes, in order to fund programs that are working and things like that. And I think that piece of it, that it is not redistribution for redistribution's sake, or it is not redistribution so that the government doesn't have to get better at budgeting. It's redistribution so that we can build regenerative institutions. We can build new containers of economics and new containers of democracy. And I think that piece of it is super important. And I think it comes through. Yes, we call for higher taxes in our Agenda for a Solidarity Economy. Maryland has wealthy people that aren't paying their fair share. We have meds and eds that aren't paying their fair share. And even though we have a Democratic trifecta and have had one, have had a decades-long veto-proof majority in both houses, we also are a wealthy Democratic state, and so Democrats tend to do this via user fee, increase revenue via user fees instead of taxes. And so, yes, we're calling for higher taxes. If anybody wants to ask, I think wealthy people should pay higher taxes. I think meds and eds should pay higher taxes. But I don't think it's just so that I, as governor, would be able to have more money in my budget. I think it is so that communities can have that money to invest in the things that are important to them and can develop the economic and democratic tools to not be reliant on nonprofit philanthropy and government. So,
yep. I think that's true. And I think, to return to the question of public banks, what public bank would allow communities to do is maximize the leverage of any of those resources, of any of that money, and make sure that it continues to recirculate in those communities or in those governing bodies that then turn around and fund things. And so there is a way to to kind of cross that bridge from redistribution to regeneration, that eventually, especially with the cooperative economy and cooperatives, worker ownership across the board as well, will start to take the form of perpetuating internal systems that are internally healthy, and that will not have to ultimately be dependent. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that it all works in a really good sequence.
Excellent. Yeah, I do too. And I'm really excited to keep talking about it. And we're also at almost 90 minutes for this show. And I want to respect your time. And so we'll definitely, open invite to come back and pick up where you just left off about like what the some of those implementations look like and what that bigger theory of regeneration looks like. But before we go, is there anything you want to leave people with, a final word, as it were, or a parting idea?
I think that the last thing I would say is the nature of making demands, and it's a pretty simple thing. I think that uh, you should demand everything. I think that the old saying, "Be reasonable, demand the impossible," is the more that I guess that my years have not conservatized me. I feel like the need for radical demands at every level and the need for demanding the democratization of every sphere of life, and particularly every sphere of material life, means that we need to continue to issue radical demands and envision radical and even utopian states of existence. And I think that it's very easy for us to become cynical, or to say that uh, because it hasn't worked so far, that we need to scrap the entire idea of kind of making things better, qualitatively better. And I just think that the movement needs to live its worldview and demand everything in order to get some things, and that movement needs to inform policy, the policy ideas, the language, the logic, all is going to emerge from that thinking that we deserve more and that we can change. And so I would say, yeah, make the big demands, ask for the big asks, and excite people, and and invite people into that vision, that things can genuinely be better.
Excellent. That is a wonderful way to leave this, Matt. I really appreciate it. Thank you for coming on tonight. This has been a great conversation. As always, I love a conversation like this with you. But I really enjoyed diving into the specifics of the way that the lessons from the public banking movement, the successes and the hurdles, help to inform a larger movement-based, economic justice rooted vision of how we make those how we make those radical demands to make people's lives better and to put us on a trajectory toward justice, toward democracy, and toward peace.
Thanks so much, and all the best to all my comrades and peeps in Baltimore.
Thank you, Matt. All right. Well, that was an excellent show. I'm always excited to have Matt come on, and it's really, really enjoyable to get to talk to him about that. We will provide resources to his articles and the links here, and then and also to our campaign's economic policy, to the Agenda for a Solidarity Economy. The next show we have is with Owen Silverman Andrews. He will be on to talk about community colleges in Maryland, some recent legislative victories, and a broader perspective of what it looks like to engage in multilingual education. So I'm really excited about that show. That's coming up next week. And for tonight, thank you. I appreciate it, and I will talk to you all soon.
Thank you.